Hello, I'm Liam and welcome to my video on how to sow tomato seed. My plan is that this video will be part of a series where I show how I grow tomatoes down here in my allotment, both inside my polytunnel, and I'm planning to put a few plants outside, and if I have space, I hope to have a few plants growing at home too. So if you like this video on how to sow tomato seed, please subscribe to the channel to see how the plants develop through the growing season. I've been growing tomatoes for quite a few years now. All types of tomatoes really, cherry tomatoes, the regular size, and also beefsteak tomatoes. What I've learned is that the size of tomatoes does make a difference in terms of ease of growing them. I think cherry tomatoes are the easiest to grow. I've had good success with regular sized tomatoes too, but I find beefsteak tomatoes, the really big sized tomatoes, to be more challenging. Some years they've grown well and others less so. What I've learnt about sowing tomato seed is that they need a warm, light environment to germinate in. And by warm, that means a temperature of about 20 degrees C. Tomato seed is surface sown, and light is also important. Those requirements for heat and light mean that an indoor sunny windowsill is ideal. A polytunnel greenhouse and a conservatory are all ideal too, provided that they're warm. It's now mid-March, actually the 15th of March, and I think this is the ideal time to be sowing tomato seed. It's easy to germinate the seed in January and February, but I find that creates a problem because after a couple of months, the plants are quite large, and because tomato plants are frost sensitive, I've got nowhere to put them. I don't want all the warm growing space I have indoors, my sunny windowsills, to be taken up all by tomato plants. And that's why I prefer to plant my seed in mid-March, because 8 weeks after mid-March is the middle of May, and by then here in the south of England the weather is warm enough that I can move my plants here inside my polytunnel. If you don't have a polytunnel, perhaps the plants could be moved outside to a tomato grow house or greenhouse. These can usually fit a couple of full-size plants inside of them and can be fitted in somewhere in a garden or on a patio. If you're planning to grow your tomatoes outside, and to be honest that can be challenging, then I would suggest sowing your tomato seed even a little bit later, perhaps at the beginning of April or even in the middle of April, to allow sufficient time for the weather to warm up before moving the plants outside. As I said at the start of the video, I'm going to be growing 3 types of tomatoes: the cherry tomatoes, regular size, and beefsteak. Perhaps my favourite variety of tomato of all that I grow is a cherry tomato called Gold. It's a really popular variety, and the plants produce lots of small orange tomatoes that are deliciously sweet. I also like to grow a variety called chocolate cherry, which is a dark red and brown coloured tomato, slightly larger than Gold, and I think it has a really nice flavour that goes well in salads. And my third variety is called Tumbling Tom Red, which, as the name suggests, is a variety that's suitable for growing in hanging baskets. I'll be sowing 4 regular types of tomato. Now my favourite regular tomato is one called Premio, and it's my favourite both because it's easy to grow and also because the fruit are a true red. It really looks like a traditional tomato and it has good flavour. I've also had good success with a yellow tomato called Golden Sunrise. The plants are slightly less prolific than Premio, but they still produce a good amount of tomatoes, and I think a yellow tomato adds interest to salads. And in addition to those tomatoes that I grow regularly, this year I'm also going to be sowing a traditional variety called Ailsa Craig, which has an excellent reputation, and another heritage variety called Black de Crimea, which, as the name suggests, is a black tomato type. I'll be really interested to see how those 2 varieties perform this year compared to the others that I normally grow. And my final variety is a beefsteak type called Marmande. As I've said earlier, I've had partial success with this. Some years it has grown well, but I am going to give it another go this year. But whatever variety of tomato I grow, I always sow the seeds in the same way. And that's the topic of this video, so let's get started. Before planting the seed, I think it's helpful to introduce what I'll be using. I've prepared in advance the tomato seed, as well as the plant labels and the black marker pen. I'm actually using some wooden lollipop sticks that I had left over. Now turning to pots. For many years I've used these plastic pots, which are about 2 inches in height and maybe 3 inches across. What I've learnt about sowing tomato seed is that both wet soil and dry soil are problematic. In wet soil the seed can rot, or the wetness after germination can cause bacterial or fungal problems that can kill the plants. but neither will tomato seed germinate in dry soil. The seed casing needs to be moist for germination to happen. And what I like about these pots is that they've got plenty of drainage holes in the bottom, and that means the water can escape, stopping the soil being too damp. But this year, in preference to the plastic pots, I'm going to be using these cocoa fibre pots. These cocoa fibre pots have the advantage of being really difficult to overwater because they're porous, letting water out and, just as importantly, air in. Perhaps the most difficult thing with using them is actually separating them from each other. What I found helpful is to pull them apart all around the sides, and then once that's done, it's easier to pull them out. They don't have any holes in the bottom, but neither do they need them because the water can escape from all around. Whichever type of pot I'm using, I'll only plant one seed per pot. Because tomato seed can be relatively expensive, especially when using F1 types, the hybrid types, that are sometimes sold with only 4 or 8 seeds in the packet. But in ideal germination conditions, I find that well over 90% of the seeds germinate, so sowing more than one seed in a pot just isn't necessary. Now, as I said earlier, it's important that the soil is neither too wet nor too dry. My technique is to water the compost at sowing, and then not water again until the seed has germinated. But to keep the soil moist before germination happens, I cover them. And what's ideal for this is some kind of tray covered with a lid and then placed on a sunny windowsill next to a patio door, or even when the weather's warm enough inside my polytunnel. And the final thing to show before getting started is the compost. I'm going to be using today this specialist seed compost. Now, specialist seed compost isn't required, normal compost will do, but specialist seed compost has a finer texture than regular compost, and that's why I'll be using it today. And I should say that the reason why I choose to use shop-bought compost rather than my own is that I'm confident that this will be weed-free, because I really don't want to be weeding my pots that my tomato seedlings are growing in. My first job in planting the tomato seed is to separate the plant pots, and I find doing this all at once is the most efficient way of doing it. This morning I'm going to be sowing 8 varieties of tomato, and I'll be sowing 2 seeds of each variety, so I'll need 16 pots in total. And that's it, the pots are ready, now to fill them with compost. I'm going to put on my gardening gloves for this part of the job. I find it easiest to fill the pots using dry compost, and I press the compost down as I put it inside the pots, just to make sure that there aren't any air gaps. And I leave about a 1 centimetre gap at the top, which makes watering easier. That's all done. That's the 16 cocoa fibre pots filled with compost. Now to water them. To water them, I'm going to use this black seed tray, which has holes in the bottom to allow the water to run out. And that way, when I water the pots, the water will run out of the pots and run out of the seed tray. After watering the pots, I leave about 5 minutes for all the water to run through to make sure that the soil is nice and moist when I come to plant the seed. I said earlier that tomato seed is surface sown, but I've adjusted my technique over the years to make germination more reliable. I found it helpful to create a small depression in the top of the soil and then plant the seed in the depression and then just loosely cover it with soil. And the reason I do this is the way tomato seeds germinate. Now, what happens with germination is out of the seed a shoot emerges, and that first shoot is actually the root. It's called the radicle, and the radical then grows downwards into the soil. And what happens next is that the seed casing is lifted up by the radicle and eventually will grow, and out of the seed casing will be the first 2 leaves. What I found is that sometimes the radicle emerges, the first root, and instead of pushing down into the soil, it gets trapped on the surface. What I try to do with my technique is that by covering the seed casing with soil, the radicle has a greater chance of pushing down into the soil because it's got the weight of the soil above it to help it. And what I'll do now is to move the camera closer and show how I plant my tomato seed. I'm going to start by writing the plant label for the seed. It's really easy to forget to do that and not know which pot contains which seed. The first 2 are going to be Sun Gold, which is the orange cherry tomato type that I mentioned earlier. And to plant the seed, I'm going to create a small depression just at the top And for speed, I'm going to do that in all the pots at once. That way I don't forget to do it, and I find it just speeds the whole process up. In terms of depth, I would say that's about 1/2 centimetre or 5 millimetres, perhaps 1/4 of an inch in old measure. Then I take the tomato seed, I only need a couple of them, and then drop them into the hole I've just made. And then very gently, just loosely cover them, just like that. I'm not pressing down as I cover them, just gently scraping a few grains of compost over the top. That also has a second advantage in helping to trap moisture around the seed, and the moisture is needed to weaken the seed casing to help it germinate. Those two are now done, and before I forget I've done them, I'm going to add the plant labels. Well, all the seeds are planted now, so the job is almost done. The final step is to move them into their final containers, ready for germination. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the seeds will need a warm environment to grow in, but I also don't want them to dry out. So I mentioned the sunny windowsill is good, but a sunny windowsill, if it gets sun for most of the day, may be too hot, and that may end up drying out the plants. So if that's the case, it's best to move them to a windowsill that gets less sun, but still plenty of light. This germination tray with the lid is unheated, which is absolutely fine if growing indoors, but if attempting to germinate in an unheated area like a polytunnel or a greenhouse, or even an unheated room, then sometimes a heated propagator can also be used. And I have my old one here that just has heating elements tucked away underneath this watertight plastic case, so there shouldn't be any risk of water and electricity mixing. And then the seeds can be popped onto this black plastic tray, and as with the unheated one, there's a plastic lid that goes on top. This year I'll be germinating my tomato seed in 3 locations. One inside my polytunnel using this heated propagator, another inside my polytunnel using this unheated propagator to see how much of a difference that makes, and also inside on a bright windowsill. Now I just need to move my cocoa fibre pots into their respective trays and the job is almost done. If your grow house has a lid like this one with a vent on top that can be slid up and down to open and close the vents, then for germination I always close the vents. Once the seeds have germinated, I'll open the vents to prevent too much moisture building up inside the grow house. But in the first week or so, trapping the moisture inside the grow house should help the seeds germinate. And that's it, that's all the tomato seeds sown. I hope you liked the video. If you did, please let me know by hitting the like button or leaving a comment. And as I mentioned at the start of the video, I hope to create more videos like this, showing how the seeds germinate and develop over the entire growing season. And if you'd like to see these videos, please subscribe to the YouTube channel in the usual way. You may also like to see my website, allotmentbook.co.uk.